Okay. Well, hello and welcome to NOAA's National Ocean Service Science Seminar Series. My name is Tracy Gill. Today and for all Tuesdays through early June, I am co-hosting a seminar series with Gyami Shrestha, Director of the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program Office. Dr. Shrestha is out of the office this week, so today's co-host is Libby Larson, Coordinator of the North American Carbon Program. Libby will offer some info on the background for the series and introduce the seminar and the speaker. But before she does, here are a few logistics and related information. The presenter today is fine with clarifying questions during the seminar. Please type them into the chat box. If you are interested in getting a PDF copy or recording of today's presentation, we will list them in the website in the chat box where you can find, and you will be able to find them there in a few.
Tracy, are you still talking?
Huh. Yeah, I can't hear anyone. I can hear you, Libby. Tracy? Ah! Well, maybe, Libby, you should launch into...
Okay.
Yeah.
Tracy will come back on, I guess, and with any other further logistic information. Hello, I'm Libby Larson, the coordinator for the North American Carbon Program, or NACP, and co-host of this webinar series today with Tracy Gill from NOAA. Today's seminar is the 8th in a 3-month seminar series titled From Science to Solutions, the State of the Carbon Cycle, which is focused on communicating the second state of the carbon cycle report, SOCCR2, findings in relation to current and broader societal impacts and solutions. This series is sponsored by the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program in partnership with NOAA. For those of you who don't know about the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program, we are an interagency partnership led by the Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group. We coordinate and facilitate federally funded carbon cycle research with the science community, and we provide leadership to the U.S. Global Change Research Program on carbon cycle science priorities. We are one of the longest-running U.S. interagency partnerships in global change research. We also led the development of the second state of the carbon cycle report, with a diverse team of over 200 U.S. and international experts. This decadal assessment underwent rigorous multi-draft peer review by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the public, and 13 federal agencies and departments before its release in late 2018. On behalf of my colleagues, I would like to express our deep gratitude to NOAA, and particularly Tracy Gill, as well as all the webinar speakers for making this 14-week webinar series possible. The recording of prior webinars are available on the YouTube channel for the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program. All pertinent slides and details of the webinar series are available on the website at carboncyclescience.us. And so today's seminar is titled State of Carbon in Soils and Agriculture, Linking North American Science to Global Efforts. And our speaker today is Dr. Nancy Cavallaro, National Program Leader, Soils, Water, and Global Change Programs, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, USDA. And here is a little bit background on her. Dr. Nancy Cavallaro has served as a National Program Leader at USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture since 2001. Managing research, extension, and education programs in soils, watersheds, and water quality, carbon and climate change, and environmental aspects of agricultural and forestry production systems. She is also the current co-chair of the U.S. Global Change Research Program's Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group, and also served for 4 years as co-chair of the Land Use and Land Cover Change Interagency Working Group. In addition to her work on the SOCCR2 report, she was part of a core writing team for the USGCRP's Decadal Strategic Plan 2012 to 2021, and contributed to the 2003 Strategic Plan of the USGCRP's Climate Change Science Program. She is the U.S. representative to the Integrated Research Group of the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases. Prior to starting at USDA, she worked primarily in academia as a researcher, professor, and sometime extension specialist at diverse locations: Cornell University, the Colegio de Postgraduados in Mexico, and the University of Puerto Rico, with short-term appointments at the Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory in New Hampshire, Army Corps of Engineers, and Texas Tech University. Welcome, Nancy, and thank you for presenting your work at the NOAA Science Seminar today.
Thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me, and so we'll get started. I think I should also note that many or most of these slides and a lot of the ideas came from the chapters themselves and the chapter leads for agriculture, Alexander Hristov at Penn State, Jane Johnson at ARS, and then for the soils chapter, the chapter leads were Kate Loita at Oregon State and Vanessa Bailey at DOE lab in PNNL, two N's, I think. Again, and then I also wanted to note that this title kind of makes it sound like I'm mostly talking about global efforts, but that's sort of towards the end. Hopefully I'll get to that. So in this presentation, the idea is, whoops. Oh, okay. I didn't know I was changing slides. How agriculture and soils fit into the whole scheme of things and the main findings from SOCCR2 related to soils. I should have put in agriculture as well. So there's some input from other chapters because soils cuts across a lot of other systems. I'll talk about some of the key uncertainties and some of the controversies in this area, and some of the carbon management efforts in these realms, as well as international efforts. Okay. So, just the chapter leads again for the main two chapters here, and then some of the other chapter leads. I'll be drawing a little bit from Maureen McCarthy's chapter on tribal lands, Elise Pendle in grasslands, and some of these other people. One of them's, I think, online, Randy Kolka, terrestrial wetlands. I'm not sure I'm going to get to that. And Ted Schuer of the Arctic and Boreal chapter. There's a little bit from him. Okay, so just for those of you who haven't been to any of these other or listened to any of these other things, I just thought I'd give a brief thing about who wrote SOCCR2 and for whom. It is a government report, but includes Canada and Mexican contributions. It's written for decision makers in the public and private sectors, as well as scientists and educators. And we hope it will be used by educators. And the purpose is to inform policies and decisions, but not to prescribe any. And then the domain of this is North America, but in a global context. And what I'll be talking about is the terrestrial side of things, but the report does include the coastal areas and out to the exclusive economic zone, which is depicted here. Okay, so, and this I think has been in almost all of the presentations in this series, and it's just to show, let me see if I can get the pointer here. Okay, so as you can see, most of the carbon, its main carbon balance for North America, most of the carbon going into the atmosphere, the biggest source is from fossil fuel emissions, and some from some other areas. And the biggest, I guess, uptake is coming from net ecosystem uptake on the land, and a fair amount in tidal waters as well. What's kind of new in this report is these lateral transfers that we understand a lot better, and I bring those up because those sort of They don't all go to the coast. Some of them form new soils or renew soils. They come from old soils. They travel down and get deposited to form new soils. So it's all about soils again. And those that are buried under or that are underwater, we call subaqueous soils. So it's all about soils. What else did I want to say here? I think that's it. So we'll launch into the soils part. And I wanted to just say I'm primarily a soil scientist, and so from my point of view, it's all about the soil. It all starts there. It's the main foundation for ecosystems and ecosystem services we depend on, and it's where our food is grown. Both plants and animals rely on the soil for their feed or for their nutrients, etc. And it's the largest reservoir of terrestrial carbon is in the soils. It's about three or four times the amount. I can't remember exactly. The amount that's in the atmosphere is the just in the top meter of soils, and many soils go down well below 1 meter depth. So just a few perspectives on this about soil. So we have carbon in soils that is organic and inorganic. The inorganic I won't be talking about. It's mostly carbonates. The organic carbon is the one that's generally more dynamic and can be more easily manipulated and is fed into directly from plants and animals. Generally speaking, rich and fertile soils are ones that are high in organic carbon. When you see these dark soils, you think they're rich and they're fertile, and that darkness mostly comes from organic carbon. And so it stores not just carbon, but also the nutrients that are within the organic carbon. Most of the nutrients that are supplied to promote plant growth is coming from the carbon part. And it tends to confer also greater resilience in many aspects. It increases the resilience to changing climate, extreme weather events, droughts, and floods. For floods, it increases the infiltration, and for droughts, it increases the amount of water that can be held in the soil and made available to plants. And so that all is a huge part of the carbon cycle. And it, let's see, but the other thing is the effects of management and environment on soil carbon and soil health is really highly variable, because there are so many different types of soils that are old and young, and different mineralogies and different textures, and that makes a big difference. So this is the kind of overall aspects of carbon cycling in soils. We have the different processes of underground litter, inputs from roots, and storage, and then a big role of the roots and the microbes, and the structure of the soil here is represented, I should be using this, by these aggregates, and then of course the inputs in forests and plants that come in, as well as the release of both CO2 and methane. And the chapter actually deals with nitrogen as well, because nitrous oxide is often expressed as carbon CO2 equivalent. So getting to key findings, I'll get that out of the way. So the estimates for soil carbon stocks in the conterminous United States plus Alaska ranges from 142 to 154 pentagrams to 1 meter depth, and you can probably add 30% onto that, or even more if you go down to 2 meters in depth. Estimates for Canada, that's the United States. So Canada has a lot more. They have more surface area. They have a lot of it's frozen. They have a lot more peatlands, and so they have quite a lot. And whereas Mexico, less land area, but also soils that are in more tropical areas and more weathered, and perhaps have less carbon. The highest uncertainty in terms of these inventories is in Mexico, because much of the data is just estimating what's below 20 centimeters, and their main sources of the data for this are from the top 20 centimeters. So we got our data from various places. The Mexican Carbon Program researchers at the Colegio de Postgraduados, where I worked at one time, put together this map of carbon in Mexico. I think Agriculture Canada people put together this map in Canada, and then we have a couple of sources in I think USGS. Where's that pointer? USGS and NRCS. That's Natural Resources Conservation Service, U.S. Geological Survey, so we can see some of the data here and how it's not entirely consistent with some of these estimates, but you can see that forests and woodlands tend to be highest, as well as pastures and rangeland soils, and then wetlands, small amount of surface area, but land area, but quite a lot of carbon as well. But agriculture has a lot as well. This is the Canadian ones. A huge one of the problems here with putting together an inventory is each country sort of has a different way of classifying things, and so it was very difficult putting together a total package. And so that's why I'm just sort of showing these contrasting ways of looking at it. But Canada, of course, has a lot of peat soils, and so a lot of that comes from there. And then, of course, the boreal region, as I mentioned, frozen soils preserves the carbon that's there, and that's really the biggest reservoir in Canadian soils. And then for Mexico, they have forest lands divided into many different categories, and grazing lands, but those are the two. Now these data are in teragrams, not pentagrams, so move the decimal point over 3 places. So about 2 pentagrams in grazing lands, about 5 in the forest lands in Mexico. Moving on, these stocks of soil carbon are very sensitive to agricultural and forestry practices and rangeland practices, generally land management. And the loss of carbon-rich soils, such as in wetlands due to land use change, are major, can provoke major changes in carbon stocks and have large releases. Just plowing up the prairie had a huge effect on carbon coming out of the soil, and that's not been returned. And so in North America, the soils have lost on average something between 20 and 75%, depending on what region. And then in Canada, their estimate is about 24% is lost simply by manipulating the soil, disturbing it in various ways. But there are ways that practices that have been developed to try and conserve the carbon in the soil, or we thought they were, and one of those is no-till. Not disturbing the soil is good for keeping carbon in the soil. However, it's not good it doesn't always work everywhere, and then that's one of the points of contention here, noted in this slide. And this came out about 10 years ago. Denis Anger, I think, is the author here. He's Canadian. Anyway, looking at, these are all, these are the averages in terms of carbon content with depth. And so what happens is when you do no-till, you accumulate more carbon in the topsoil than if you had tilled up the soil, but you may be also keeping all the roots and in the surface as well, and so then you might deplete some of the carbon that's in farther down at 20 centimeters, and so it might just come out to zero effect in total carbon, depending. So in some, that's where the different soil types and the different ecosystem types are going to make a big difference on how effective some of these practices are in increasing carbon. This also talks about one of the other problems is questions out there is, how often you harvest forest and how is that depleting the soil, and it's really is hard to figure this this one out. Let's see, the difference between the conifer and the hardwoods. You can see the green are the hardwoods, the orange are the conifers, and they react a little bit different. And then the difference between these are the differences between the control and those that are harvested normally and those that are harvested more frequently. And it's a little bit all over the place, so a little bit difficult and needs more study, I guess. So then moving on, the evidence is to another key finding. The evidence is really strong for direct effects of increased temperature. What's happening with climate change? How is that going to affect the soil carbon and the balance of emissions and uptake? It is considered that warming and atmospheric CO2 increasing temperature will increase the loss of carbon and emissions, but warming and atmospheric carbon dioxide can increase plant production, which then in many ecosystems, and that could result in greater carbon inputs to the soil. And so what the balance is unclear, but the latest consensus, not consensus, but estimates are that global warming is projected to release 55 pentagrams of carbon over the next 35 years. So that's a pretty sizable emissions there. Another key finding has to do with the loss of carbon from soils, particularly from peatland soils. So peatlands, those are soils that are organic. They're usually in wetland areas, often underwater or flooded most of the year. So that can be a significant flux to the atmosphere because of disturbance. Some of these lands, the peat soil is very fertile, so they want to drain it and plant crops. And of course, once you drain it, then it releases a whole lot of carbon into the atmosphere. Same goes for frozen soil. So in the Arctic chapter, we can see that about that same 5 to 15% of soil organic carbon stored in soils that are permanently frozen that will then be is vulnerable to release on warming. So those are dangers. Another main point here is about these what do you call the losses of carbon. So depending on how things are managed, what kind of land use it is, we have emissions or uptake overall. And you can see, for instance, the production of hay and forages tends to increase the carbon in the soil. Across the board, it's more or less a wash, about zero when you add it all up. But then the organic soils, these peatland soils that are sometimes drained for agriculture and other uses and development, they're like the main source, and that's what gives the soil carbon a bad name, or agriculture, I guess, a bad name in terms of release of carbon into the atmosphere. And then just to note here, the potential vulnerability of soil carbon stocks to climate warming in a meta-analysis is shown here. A lot of loss of carbon, a lot of vulnerable carbon, mainly in the northern areas in the Arctic regions. So basically, a lot of the critical knowledge gaps around carbon have to do with soils, these boreal soils and Arctic ecosystems, the inland waters, and Mexico. We still have less data and fewer studies to go by for analyzing what's going on there. Although there have been a lot of progress in the last 5 years, I would say. So now I'll move on to the agriculture chapter, and so the chapter leads again Jane Johnson and Alex Ristov. Several of these slides came to me from Benjamin Runkle, who presented at the AGU meetings because Alex and Jane couldn't be there. So agriculture, some important perspectives on agriculture in general. So agriculture is worldwide something like 25% 20 to 25% of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, are thought to come from agricultural practices. In the U.S. or in North America, that's a bit less, more like 8 or 9%. But the main culprits from agriculture are CO2 from soil and land degradation and land conversions, and a lot of that coming from organic soils, but also excessive fertilizers producing nitrous oxide. Again, it's not carbon, but it's a carbon equivalent, and it's a very strong greenhouse gas. Manure management and produces nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, and methane. And methane is agriculture's like the main culprit, one of the main culprits for methane and nitrous oxide. Another thing to think about here is that if agriculture is a net emitter, then if we waste food, then we have to plant more area and grow more food, and that is adding to the problem. Plus the food waste mostly goes to CO2 as it's degraded. Producers and land managers are influenced not just by policies and by regulations, but also the public and markets that influence these, that influence their profits. So so that's an important thing to consider on how we might think about how we can move forward and reduce emissions from agriculture. Another important thing to keep in mind is that good yields and sustainable, resilient systems are in agriculture are generally the ones that have the lowest carbon footprint, or at least lowest per amount of production of food. So moving to the key findings here, the predictions of global soil carbon change in Earth system models through this century have a pretty wide range, but the mean is around 65 pentagrams of carbon, and the Earth system models projecting large gains do so largely by projecting increases in high latitude soil carbon that are inconsistent with empirical studies. And so probably this average is closer to what's really going to be happening. In terms of bottom-up emissions estimates, agricultural greenhouse gases in 2015, again, we're now talking about teragrams, but that's just in 1 year. So the bulk is from the U.S., but Canada and Mexico as well. And non-CO2 emissions, nitrous oxide and methane largely from enteric methane. Now, enteric methane, if you don't know what that is, so ruminant type animals, that includes cows and sheep, they produce methane in their digestion system. In the very first stomach that everything goes into, methane is often produced. And so that's what we call enteric methane. And so we have pretty high numbers of these in terms of totals. Manure management producing a little less. Soil management has the highest number here. Rice production, that's going to be mostly nitrous oxide and methane. Let's see, some areas they burn agricultural residues, so that's another source that's important. So the total by country, again, the U.S. is the biggest emitter there. So again, I wanted to make the point here about humans are the decisions that humans make in how they're managing our land and our agricultural systems and our production systems are really key. Agricultural carbon budgets and net emissions are directly affected by human decision makings and the trends in food production and agricultural management, and therefore budgets fluctuate significantly with changes in global markets, diets, consumer demand, regional policies, and various incentives of that kind. One of the things that's happening, for instance, is the growing demand for organic agriculture, grass-fed beef, that'll have an effect on the profits. It's not huge yet, but if it grows, that'll have a big effect. So this one of the things that has happened, there's been a growth in consumption of dairy products, but a reduction, considerable reduction in the production of the demand for beef products. And of course, dairy production is more efficient in carbon-wise, so that's a good thing. In terms of where the carbon stocks are in agricultural systems, it's mostly in the soil, and it's controlled by cropland management practices largely. What's in the soil. Practices can increase soil carbon stocks. That can increase soil carbon stocks, mainly maintaining land cover. In other words, not, harvesting everything and leaving bare soil. Deep-rooted crops are particularly good at it. Cover crops is another practice that's been growing in popularity. That's when you're planting a crop that's annual, you harvest, and then in between the crops, before you can plant the next one because winter's coming, you plant something to keep the soil covered. And protecting the soil from erosion is very important, using reduced or no tillage and improving the nutrient management. So keeping those plants growing is the key, keeping them on the soil, keeping them growing, and producing and taking up carbon from the atmosphere. Management-related carbon stock changes have strong regional differences and environmental differences. Soil types makes a big difference, and so responses to changes in management practice can vary a lot and need to be tuned to the environment, soil type, and production systems. Again, here, one of the production systems that produces a lot of food for or high yields in general are draining organic soils, but they are producing a lot of carbon is lost from those soils every year. There's some organic soils in Florida where they've built a research station. They have to add a step every 12 years. Because that's how many inches of soil is lost. Some of that's not just due to loss of the carbon, but some of it's due to compaction as well. So another key finding, North America's growing population can achieve benefits such as reduced greenhouse gas emissions, increased water and air quality, reduce methane fluxes in flooded or anoxic systems, and increase food availability. How they can do it is part of the way that can be done is really managing carefully and optimizing nitrogen fertilizer. Partly because excess nitrogen fertilizer can, part of that turns into nitrous oxide, which is a very strong greenhouse gas. But there's a high spatial and temporal variability in the need for that nitrogen, and so managing the fertilizer in a spatially explicit way and matching the amount of fertilizers, and not just nitrogen, but nitrogen is a big one, to the needs of the crop in timing and in space. So how to reduce methane? So the strategies available to mitigate livestock enteric emissions and manure emissions. There are many promising strategies. A lot of it has to do with feed for the animals, the beef cattle mainly, and managing the manure to avoid methane emissions and keep things aerated at least. And so there are many promising technologies for this, and they can reduce emissions by 20 to 30%, and that's in sort of just the standard practice. Increasing forage digestibility, increasing corn or legume versus grass silage, and various feed additives can reduce the methane from enteric methane. And up to for manure management, that can be very specific to the type of system, but up to 80% of the manure methane emissions could be reduced if carefully managed. So basically, methane mitigation strategies have to be evaluated on a production system scale to account for emission trade-offs and co-benefits, such as improved feed efficiency and productivity of livestock. I wanted to bring in a little bit about the grasslands. This is from the grasslands chapter here. Let's see. So one of the things that affects the carbon that accumulates in grasslands is woody encroachment. That's when woody species come in to areas that are generally grassy. Overall, in most cases, that will increase the carbon stocks. Just converting from pastures or native grasslands to croplands tends to be emit a lot of carbon. A lot more will be stored in native grasslands than in croplands generally, but managing the pastures well with fertilization, species selection, and grazing management can increase the carbon in these grasslands. Huge amounts can be increased. There's a, let's see, yeah, here. I don't know if you can read this. Soil carbon in intensively managed pastures in southwestern United States we've been able to increase soil carbon by like 8 tons per hectare, which is a lot of carbon. But those are on degraded soils, and so that's not going to happen every year. Anyway, some points of contention in terms of livestock and production and carbon. Is livestock grazing good or bad for the soil carbon and soil health and greenhouse gas balance? Well, it depends, but we have there's differences of opinion and many different ways to manage grazing. Intensive management so that high stocking rates for short periods of time and multi-paddocks, so you have to have a lot of management there, can increase soil carbon quite rapidly, and that was that 8 tons per hectare that I was talking about. There's general agreement that some grazing is better than no grazing in terms of accumulating soil carbon in grasslands, but then the amount is going to depend on a lot of different factors, and so there's some controversy over the best practices and how to manage it. And there's a lot of, it's hard to do those experiments to find out what's the answer for where. So generally management and stocking levels need to adapt to weather conditions such as droughts. And then there are all these interactions that go on that affect the carbon with the livestock and the soil carbon and the microbiome, etc., and the species distribution is all affected by grazing practices that can be good or bad for soil carbon accumulation. So feedbacks, another key finding from this chapter has to do with feedbacks on methane. It is projected that climate change, in other words, how's climate change going to affect the greenhouse gas emissions from these systems, and so it's likely that increasing the changing climate's not going to have a huge effect on enteric methane emissions. So it's up, but methane emissions from livestock manure management are almost surely going to increase, and thus the need for better management of the manure. Potential effects of climate change on agricultural soil carbon stocks are difficult to assess because of they vary a lot according to the nature of the change that's happening in the climate and specific ecosystem characteristics and the production system and the management type. But we do know a lot for specific types of systems, more on the big crops like corn and wheat. We know a lot more about how to manage those now than we did the last several years. One of the things that wasn't brought out a whole lot in this chapter is paddy rice. Paddy rice is a flooded system, and therefore with less oxygen, and so methane is the emitter. The emissions for carbon emission is a lot of that is from methane, and also nitrous oxide. So there's still many unknowns about this, but there's been a lot of progress in these last 10 years with new varieties that increase productivity. The productivity means carbon's going into the product and not into the soil to turn into methane. And so they've reduced emissions. Intermittent flooding by oxidizing the soil. We get carbon dioxide, but that's less potent than the methane. And so that's a reduction in net greenhouse gas warming, at least, global warming. But there are many unknowns about the influence of soil and environmental factors on the best management practices and how much methane and nitrous oxide will come out of paddy rice systems. There are some that produce very little, and we don't really know why, although there's some studies ongoing right now to try and get to the heart of that. So some perspectives. Whole farm modeling is still challenging, but needed for trying to figure out more specifics to your farm and how you can best manage it. And there are some decision support tools out there for figuring out how best to manage your farm if you're interested in reducing greenhouse gas and carbon emissions. We need systems level research, and climate smart agriculture is a great opportunity for projects that maintain food supplies and fight climate change at the same time. And I think there's a lot of promise there. So some strategies to reduce agricultural greenhouse gases that we know about. Grazing and livestock management, I've brought this up already a couple of times. We can reduce enteric methane emissions but we don't have a cost benefit analysis, and figuring out the best way to manage our grazing to reduce enteric methane is still open for discussion. But we know that in some areas it's worked really well. Agriculture and cropland waste management, basically deep-rooted crops, perennial systems are going to hold on to the soil and accumulate more soil. Hold on to the carbon in the soil and accumulate more carbon in the soil. Again, avoid draining these peatland soils. Restoring drained wetlands is good, and converting from upland crops, if you've drained these wetlands, and planting paddy rice would be a way to still make a profit, produce food, and have less loss of carbon from the soil. Improved nutrient management, especially nitrogen, and reducing food waste will all go towards reducing the carbon footprint of agriculture. Wetland restoration or creation, again, is pointed out here, but as we do that, we want to make sure we're not creating too strong a source of methane emissions, because methane is a stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Okay, and then there are various practices we can learn from traditional knowledge, and this comes from the tribal chapter, talking about some very successful efforts on tribal lands of examples of how to manage their particular systems. And this is sort of just a scheme for composting that goes way back, that accumulates a lot of carbon in these trenches, and then you move the trenches over, and pretty soon you have a very large filled in area after years of really high carbon soils that are very fertile. Some ideas also in terms of, we're learning a lot more about microbiomes. What are the microbial communities in the soils that are important, and can they be manipulated to reduce greenhouse gases? Microbiomes not just in the soils, but in the can we manipulate the soil microbiome to increase the efficiency of carbon use by those microorganisms and therefore increase carbon storage? Can we manipulate the rumen microbiome. That is the microbes that are in the rumen that are producing methane. They don't have to. They could produce other products, and can we manipulate that to increase or decrease methane emissions, enteric methane emissions? And what are potential interactions between this? This is where, you know, grazing might come in, and it could be that the manure from the livestock is helping to influence the microbiome in the soil, and therefore the carbon storage and carbon use efficiency. And what are the trade-offs? Disease resistance, water quality, food safety. Those are important areas that need to be studied more. And can we produce more food from perennial crops? And how will this influence the soil microbiome and the carbon balance in the end over the long run? So there are a lot of questions there. So I wanted to end by talking a little bit about what was in the title of this talk, about some international groups that we participate in and partner with in soils and agriculture. So this is just sort of a list. I'll talk a little bit more about these first ones, but Carbo-NA is just the Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. agreement to work together on carbon across the continent, and that includes, of course, agriculture, and a big part of the Mexican carbon program is also dedicated to soil and agricultural greenhouse gases. So wait, next slide. So this one of the things that was started about 10 years ago, the International Soil Carbon Network. It started out as the National Soil Carbon Network and has grown to be international. And there's the website for it. It facilitates data sharing, assembles databases, identifies gaps in data coverage, and enables spatially explicit assessments of soil carbon in the context of climate, land use, all these biotic variables, ecosystems, and landscape. And they're partnering with several of the other things in international efforts as well. New on the scene, just a few years old, is the International Soil Modeling Consortium, and they have 573 members, and they're working on modeling to help figure out what's going to happen into the future and how a lot of these interactions that would be hard to study in terms of experiments to how that's going to affect soil health. And a lot of soil health has to do with soil carbon. They have some databases that they're working on, and a lot of models that they're doing model intercomparisons for to look at soil productivity and soil carbon. And then we have the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases. That's the GRA. There's the website for it. And that includes 50 countries, 6 continents, and some NGO type of partners, including the what's CGIAR stand for? Those are the international agricultural research stations around the world. The World Bank's part of it. They have 4 research groups: livestock, croplands, paddy, rice, and the integrated one, or the cross-cutting one. And these flagships, I think, are important. Jane and I both participate, and Alex participate in some of these. Soil carbon sequestration is a big one, enteric fermentation. So trying to get all these countries together and figure out how the findings in this country and that country can help us understand better the processes and how we can project into areas where we don't have studies across the globe. There's an inventories one on the nitrogen cycle, reducing greenhouse gases in rice systems, and circular bioeconomy. Another group that we've partnered with a fair amount is the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, and that's mainly focused on methane and burning, agricultural burning, or black carbon, what we call that. And then one more slide, I think, about that. Other initiatives. So CIRCASA is the coordination of international research cooperation on soil carbon sequestration. Again, they're partnering with the GRA and part of the soil carbon flagship project. And they partner with the Global Soil Partnership. The European Union has a European Commission's Joint Programming Initiative in food and climate change and the environment. And they're partnering with these international research stations, as well as this WLE or watershed research stations, all part of the agricultural research stations. The first one, CCAFS, is a climate change one, and the other was water. And then there's this big 4 per mil initiative that came out of, was launched in COP21. There are 35 member countries. The U.S. is kind of partnering, just looking on, but they didn't sign on as members. But the idea is again, to demonstrate that agricultural soils can play a crucial role in food security. And so these numbers are, if we could increase by 0.4% the organic carbon in soils, we would offset all the fossil fuel emissions that are going on. And of course, if we can reduce those, then we don't have to, then we'll have an easier time of it. That may be unachievable, 4 per mil, but it's a goal, and that's where the name comes from. It's not that we expect to be able to do that. And this initiative calls on partners to implement practical actions to increase soil carbon storage. So that's kind of the end. I don't have a really wrap-up slide, but this is the website where you can look at the second state of the carbon cycle report and the various chapters in there. There's my name again and my email address. And within this, if you go to this website, you can find all the chapter leads and chapter authors and some of their contact information as well. So I will leave you with that, and if there are any questions.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. And it looks like you do have some comments and questions online. The first one by James Butler, he said, never mind, I think Nancy addressed it. The second one, John Porterfield asks, is USDA tapping information available from citizen scientist farmers active with https://onpasture.com?
So yes, somewhat. Some of those things are just getting started, and but we have actually USDA has funded some citizen science in this area, and it's very useful. And we hope to. A lot of these initiatives are out of the private sector, and we're just starting to create that more dialogue in that realm and getting this information, because it's really good. We have some ways where we're collecting that Natural Resources Conservation Service is also collecting some data from citizen scientists, if you will, reporting in their websites and reporting back on the decision support tools that they have out there. Okay, so next question. Analysis seems to focus on animal husbandry such as grazing. Did the study examine more intensive systems such as poultry and pigs, both domestically and internationally? Basically, the poultry and pigs idea is manure management, and there's a lot of work on that. A lot of it's kind of specific to the area and the climate and the different production systems. Certainly, pigs and poultry are not don't produce enteric methane, so the focus is more on the manure and those systems. Aquaculture, we didn't do much with that in this report. But USDA does look at that, and any kind of wetlands production system. I know there have been some studies on that in converting back to wetlands and getting profit for the landowners through shrimp production and mariculture. So there's some work on that. I don't have a lot of that in my own portfolio, so I can't tell you much. And Christina Negra, thank you. Consultative CGIAR, Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research. But now it generally just goes as CGIAR. And then Loria Agueles asks if I'm working actively with states that are trying to focus on greenhouse gas reductions as part of climate mitigation adaptation strategies, such as Maryland has a goal of 40% reduction by 2030 and has a great deal of agricultural land. Well, I guess at the federal level, we need to work more with the states that are doing this. But what we depending on who's at the helm and what our priorities at the federal level are, we can what the best we can do, I think, in this climate right now, political climate, is just provide the information to the states so that they can move forward. So that's what we are trying to. That's our strategy right now. Any other questions?
So John Porterfield had two, and I don't know if you addressed them or you just didn't have time, but the one at the top about the drawdown, and then the one right below Peter Edwards' question.
Oh, let's see, that at the top, seaweed and cattle. I'm not sure.
Technical solutions, including 20 coming attractions that are not shovel ready, adding a small amount of seed to cattle feed. So that the adding the seaweed to cattle feed is part of what's been able to, what that estimate and how much we can reduce enteric methane. There are some sometimes negative effects, and so that but looking at that at the farm scale and optimizing that, in some areas, yes, reductions of 90% have been seen. There are different strategies, and that's a very promising one for sure. What was the other one here? John asks again, is the single greatest constraint on soil carbon uptake lack of water at optimal time amount to support plant growth?
Well, in some areas that is probably the single greatest constraint, so that's where sort of the management, it may just take a long time, but irrigation where possible can certainly help, but then there are trade-offs with that as well. Lack of water at optimal times is definitely a constraint to any kind of plant growth, which then affects the soil carbon. But I don't know that it's the single greatest constraint on soil carbon uptake, because anything that's going to limit plant growth is going to do it. So in some areas it's water. Some areas have plenty of water, and it varies from year to year also. So yeah, but actually building up the soil carbon, the carbon in the soils helps to minimize those constraints. So once you can get to the point where you have enough carbon, you have a good soil structure, then you can have more water holding capacity, and that constraint is diminished. So it's getting to that point that we're looking for. If we remember back to the big drought in 2012 in the Midwest, a lot of corn was lost, a lot of crops, but there were also areas where there were really healthy soils, where the farmers really took care of their soils and built it up, had a lot of carbon, and we had record yields in that same year that some people were just going bust, and other farmers were having record yields in the same area. And so that's what we'd like to move towards, and this idea of 4 per mil is one sort of concept of inspiring people to do that.
Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions, and we're at about the top of the hour. So Nancy, thank you so much. That you had a lot of slides, and you got all the information in, and you answered all the questions. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
And folks online, if you want to get a PDF of this, Gyami will be putting this online in a few days, or you can email either one of us at the email shown there. There's going to be lots of information at that link at the top if you want to grab it. And Nancy, any last words? Thank you so much.
No, but this was fun, and you know I know it was going to be a danger because I'm as a soil scientist I can go on for hours about soils, so I'm glad I didn't go too far. And thanks to y'all for listening.
Yeah, thanks attendees, and thanks to Libby Larson for stepping in for Guillaume, and thank you to the captioner for doing that. Hold on, Libby might have a, no, I think we're good. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody, and thanks again, Nancy.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.